The universe was a cold and quiet place. Most species who traveled between the stars had learned this simple truth long ago. Space did not care about your hopes or your fears. It simply existed, vast and empty, and utterly indifferent to the small creatures who dared to cross its endless darkness. On the distant edge of civilized space, a monitoring station floated in orbit around a pale blue world called Velar Prime. The station belonged to the Galactic Council, a gathering of nearly 200 species who had come together centuries ago to maintain peace and order among the stars. Inside the station, dozens of technicians worked at their consoles, watching and listening and waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever happened on Velar Prime. It was a quiet posting, a place where old soldiers went to finish their careers and young officers went to begin them. The most exciting event in recent memory had been a minor asteroid collision with an uninhabited moon 3 years ago. But on this particular night, everything changed. Technician was the first to notice the signal. He was a small creature with gray skin and large black eyes, and he had been working the night shift for nearly 6 standard years. He knew every pattern, every frequency, every normal transmission that passed through his sector of space. This signal was different. This signal made his blood run cold. It was a distress call, an emergency transmission on the universal frequency reserved for the most desperate situations. Trace the signal to the system, a remote cluster of worlds at the very edge of Council territory. The message came from a species called a gentle race known throughout the galaxy for their kindness and their remarkable medical technologies. Listened to the message 3 times before he believed what he was hearing. The colony on 4 was under attack. Enemy ships had surrounded the planet. Ground forces were landing in the capital city. Civilians were dying by the thousands. The attackers were Even the name sent a shiver through the monitoring station. There were raiders, nomads who traveled from system to system, taking what they wanted and destroying everything else. They were massive creatures, standing nearly 8 feet tall with armored bodies and 4 powerful arms. They felt no mercy. They knew no compassion. They enslaved the weak and killed anyone who resisted. The Galactic Council had tried to stop them before. Diplomatic missions had been sent. Peace treaties had been offered. They had responded by eating the diplomats and using the treaty documents as fuel for their fires. Commander received the report within the hour. He was an old soldier, a veteran of 3 conflicts, and he understood immediately how bad the situation was. They had no military to speak of. They were healers, not warriors. Their colony on 4 held nearly 100,000 civilians, including children and elderly who could not possibly escape. Called an emergency session of the Council. Representatives gathered from across the galaxy, their holographic images flickering to life in the great chamber on Velar Prime. They argued and debated and discussed options, as they always did. Some wanted to send a fleet immediately. Others pointed out that the nearest Council warships were 3 weeks away. By the time they arrived, they would be either dead or in chains. The debate went on for 3 full cycles. Politicians made speeches. Diplomats proposed compromises. Military commanders presented strategies that everyone knew would fail. Meanwhile, on 4, they continued their slaughter. It was Ambassador who finally spoke the words that changed everything. He was a small reptilian creature with bright orange scales and eyes that never seemed to blink. He had been sitting quietly throughout the debate, listening and thinking and waiting for the right moment. Suggested that they contact the humans. The chamber fell silent. Every representative turned to look at the small ambassador, their expressions ranging from confusion to horror. The humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic community. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel a decade ago, and most species still did not know quite what to make of them. What everyone knew was that humans came from a death world. Earth was a planet where the very environment seemed designed to kill its inhabitants. The gravity was crushing. The weather was violent. Predators lurked in every forest and every ocean. Diseases spread like wildfire. Natural disasters destroyed entire regions without warning. And yet humans had survived. Not only survived, but thrived. They had clawed their way to the top of their planet's food chain through sheer determination and an almost frightening capacity for violence. They had fought wars against each other for thousands of years, developing weapons and tactics that other species could barely imagine. When humans first made contact with the galactic community, many council members had wanted to quarantine them, to keep these dangerous creatures isolated on their death world where they could not harm anyone else. But others had argued for inclusion, pointing out that humans also showed remarkable capacity for cooperation, creativity, and compassion. Now was suggesting that they ask for help. Captain Jack received the transmission 3 hours later. He was aboard the United Earth Navy vessel Resolute, conducting a routine patrol near the gate. Was a tall man in his early 40s with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. He had fought in the Luna Uprising 15 years ago. He had led the defense of the Titan colony during the pirate raids of 2847. He knew war better than most men knew peace. His executive officer, Commander Kate, stood beside him as they reviewed the council's request. Was a sharp woman with red hair pulled back in a tight bun and a mind that could calculate firing solutions faster than most computers. She had served with for 6 years and trusted him completely. The request was simple. They were dying. The council could not help them in time. Would humanity be willing to intervene? Read the tactical data carefully. The fleet consisted of 15 warships, including a dreadnought-class carrier. They had already landed ground forces on the planet. Approximately 70,000 remained alive, hiding in underground shelters. They had perhaps 72 hours before those shelters were breached. The Resolute was a single ship. She was fast and well-armed, but she could not take on an entire fleet alone. Would need reinforcements. He would need a strike force capable of hitting hard and fast before the enemy even knew they were coming. He opened a channel to Earth Command and began transmitting his report. His voice was calm and steady, betraying none of the cold anger building in his chest. Somewhere in the darkness of space, innocent people were dying. Predators were hunting prey that could not fight back. Had spent his entire career protecting those who could not protect themselves. He was not about to stop now. The humans were coming, and they would not come quietly. Admiral had not slept in 36 hours. She stood before the holographic display in the Earth Defense Command Center in Geneva, watching data streams flow across the screen like rivers of light. Around her, officers scrambled to coordinate what would become the fastest military deployment in human history. Was a small woman with silver hair and a face lined by decades of service. She had commanded fleets, won battles, and buried more friends than she cared to count. She understood war in ways that most people could never imagine. She also understood something that the Galactic Council had not yet learned about humanity. When humans heard a cry for help, they did not send one ship. They did not form committees or hold debates. They moved as a pack, fast and silent and deadly, like the wolves their ancestors had both feared and admired. The council had expected perhaps 1 or 2 vessels. They did not understand what they had awakened. Within 4 hours, a strike force was assembled and ready to deploy. The Resolute would lead the formation, her experienced crew and advanced sensors making her the perfect command vessel. Accompanying her would be the heavy cruisers Vengeance and Iron Dawn, both of them built for one purpose only. These were warships in the truest sense of the word, designed to bring overwhelming firepower to bear against any enemy foolish enough to stand against them. 3 destroyer escorts rounded out the fleet. These smaller vessels carried full complements of Marines, soldiers trained for ground combat in any environment. They were hard men and women who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments humanity could offer. Captain Ben Torres commanded the Vengeance. He was a broad man with dark skin and a beard that regulations technically did not allow. Nobody had ever been brave enough to mention this to him. Tors had served in the Luna uprising alongside, and the two men trusted each other with their lives. When Tors received his orders, he simply nodded and began preparing his ship for battle. He did not ask questions. He did not request clarification. A distress signal had been received. Innocent people were dying. That was all he needed to know. On the Resolute, Sergeant Danny Cole briefed his Marine squad in the drop bay. Cole was a broad-shouldered man from Texas who spoke with a slow drawl that made people underestimate him. This was usually a mistake. Cole had fought insurgents on 3 colony worlds before his 30th birthday. He had earned more combat decorations than any other Marine in active service. His team listened in focused silence as he outlined what little they knew about the enemy was large and strong. They had armored exoskeletons that could resist most conventional weapons. They had 4 arms and claws capable of tearing through steel plating. Most species considered them unstoppable. Cole smiled at this. It was not a friendly smile. He reminded his Marines that humans had been called unstoppable once, back when they were still confined to their death world, killing each other over patches of land and differences in belief. They had faced enemies who seemed invincible. They had faced diseases that killed millions. They had faced natural disasters that wiped out entire civilizations. And they had survived. Every single time, against every possible odd, they had survived. They did not know what was coming for them. They had never faced a species forged in the fires of a death world. They had never fought creatures who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to kill and how to endure. Lieutenant Commander Alex Harper, the chief tactical officer aboard the Resolute, ran simulations in his quarters. Harper was a quiet man who preferred numbers to people. He could look at a battlefield and see patterns that others missed, possibilities that others ignored. The fleet consisted of approximately 15 vessels, their dreadnought alone the entire human strike force. On paper, the enemy held every advantage. They had more ships, more firepower, more soldiers on the ground. Harper studied the data for hours, running scenario after scenario through his tactical computer. By the time he finished, he had identified 17 different ways to defeat the fleet. 3 of them had acceptable casualty projections. One of them was almost elegant in its simplicity. He brought his findings to Captain, who reviewed them with careful attention, asked questions. Harper answered them. By the end of their meeting, both men understood exactly what needed to be done. The fleet entered fold space at exactly 600 hours standard time. Fold space was a human innovation, a method of faster-than-light travel that most galactic species considered theoretically impossible. Human scientists had looked at the theories, shrugged their shoulders, and built a working prototype anyway. This was typical of the species. The journey to 4 would take 18 hours. For most of that time, the crews prepared for battle. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Armor was fitted. Prayers were offered to whatever gods the soldiers believed in. Commander walked the corridors of the Resolute, speaking with crew members, offering encouragement, answering questions. She knew that many of them were afraid. Fear was natural. Fear was healthy. Fear kept you sharp and alert and alive. What mattered was not whether you felt fear. What mattered was what you did with it. In his quarters, Captain recorded a personal message for his daughter. She was 17 years old and living with her mother on the Mars colony. He told her that he loved her. He told her that he was proud of her. He told her that sometimes people had to do difficult things, not because they wanted to, but because it was right. Then he deleted the message and wrote a new one, simpler and shorter. He told her to be brave. He told her to be kind. He told her to never stop fighting for what she believed in. As the fleet approached its destination, addressed his crew over the intercom. His voice was calm and measured, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than impending combat. He reminded them that somewhere in the darkness ahead, innocent beings were dying. Families were being torn apart. Children were crying for parents who would never come. He reminded them that the galaxy had called for help, and humanity had answered. He did not promise them victory. He did not promise them survival. He promised them only the opportunity to make a difference, to stand between the helpless and those who would harm them. The crew of the Resolute listened in silence. When finished speaking, nobody cheered. Nobody shouted battle cries or pounded their fists against the walls. They simply returned to their duties with quiet determination in their eyes. The wolves were coming, and the wolves were hungry. The human fleet emerged from fold space like ghosts materializing from thin air. One moment there was nothing but empty void. The next moment 6 warships hung in the darkness, their weapons already charging, their crews already at battle stations. Captain studied the tactical display with the cold focus of a predator sizing up its prey. The fleet was positioned exactly where intelligence had predicted, arranged in a standard orbital bombardment formation above 4. Their weapons were systematically destroying settlements on the planet's surface below. Columns of smoke rose from burning cities. Emergency signals flooded every frequency, desperate voices crying out for help that had seemed like it would never come. 3 raider ships had already landed on the planet. Their troops were sweeping through the capital city, rounding up survivors, killing anyone who resisted. Scanner data showed approximately 40,000 still alive, huddled in underground shelters beneath the ruins of their homes. Commander reported the numbers in a flat voice. They had perhaps 6 hours before those shelters were breached. After that, there would be no survivors. Gave his orders quietly. There would be no negotiations with no warnings, no offers of surrender. The Council had tried diplomacy with these creatures before. They had tried reason and compromise and peaceful solutions. They had responded with mockery and slaughter. Humanity would respond differently. The Resolute fired first. Her main accelerated tungsten rounds to nearly 1% of, sending them screaming across the void toward the nearest destroyer. The enemy ship had no warning. One moment its crew was celebrating another successful raid. The next moment their vessel was splitting in half, venting atmosphere and bodies into the cold embrace of space. Warlord received the report on the bridge of his dreadnought and felt something he had not experienced in many years. Confusion. His fleet had detected no approaching vessels. His sensors had shown nothing but empty space. And yet, now 6 unknown ships were tearing through his formation like a blade through soft flesh. Was old for nearly 60 standard years, and he had conquered more worlds than he could remember. He had faced the best warriors a dozen species could offer. He had never lost a battle. He had never even come close. He studied the enemy vessels with growing interest. They were smaller than his ships, sleeker, built for speed rather than brute force. Their weapons were unusual, using projectiles instead of energy beams. Their tactics were aggressive to the point of recklessness. Ordered his fleet to engage. 15 warships wheeled toward the human formation, their weapons charging, their crews eager for combat. They had crushed every opponent they had ever faced. These strange newcomers would be no different. Was wrong. The human ships moved with terrifying coordination. They did not fight like council species, trading volleys at long range while carefully protecting their precious vessels. They fought like pack hunters, working together with an almost supernatural awareness of each other's movements and intentions. The Vengeance dove directly into the heart of the formation. Captain Torres stood on his bridge with his arms crossed, calling out targets in a steady voice as his gunners poured fire into everything that moved. His point defense systems created a sphere of death around his ship, shredding incoming missiles before they could find their marks. 2 frigates tried to flank the Vengeance. The Iron Dawn cut them off, her punching holes through their engine sections and leaving them drifting helplessly in the void. Captain Maria Santos commanded the Iron Dawn, a woman who had grown up in the slums of New and clawed her way to command through sheer determination. She showed no mercy because she had never been shown any herself. Meanwhile, the three destroyer escorts executed a flanking maneuver that cut off the escape route. When two raider ships tried to flee, they found themselves boxed in by vessels that seemed to anticipate their every move. The destroyers worked together like fingers on a single hand, herding their prey into kill zones and tearing them apart with coordinated fire. Lieutenant Commander Harper called out tactical updates from his station. His voice never wavered, never showed emotion, even as the Resolute shook from enemy weapons' impacts. He was doing what he had been trained to do. He was solving a puzzle, finding patterns, exploiting weaknesses. The dreadnought was the key. It was the largest vessel in their fleet, the source of their command and control, the symbol of their power. Harper had studied its design for hours during the journey to 4. He knew its strengths. More importantly, he knew its weaknesses. He directed the fleet to concentrate fire on the dreadnought's engine section. Rounds slammed into the massive vessel one after another, each impact weakening its structural integrity. They tried to maneuver, tried to bring their forward weapons to bear, but the human ships were too fast, too agile, dancing around the lumbering giant like wolves around a wounded bear. The battle lasted 47 minutes. By its end, 11 ships were drifting wreckage. 3 had surrendered after their crews witnessed what happened to those who resisted. The dreadnought commanded was crippled, its engines destroyed, its weapons silenced, its proud hull by dozens of impacts. Stood on his ruined bridge and stared at the tactical display in disbelief. More than 2/3 of his fleet was gone. His warriors, the finest soldiers in the galaxy, had been swept aside like insects before a storm. He had underestimated these humans. He had made the same mistake that so many others had made throughout history. He had assumed that because humans were small and soft and fragile-looking, they would be easy prey. Captain opened a channel to the flagship. His face appeared on the enemy, calm and expressionless, showing nothing of the cold fury burning behind his eyes. His message was brief and left no room for misunderstanding. The ground forces had 1 hour to release all prisoners and surrender unconditionally. Every soldier, every weapon, every vehicle would be handed over to human custody. There would be no negotiations. There would be no second chances. If they refused, there would be no further communication, only consequences. Then he closed the channel and turned to his crew. The space battle was over. The real fight was about to begin. Warlord received the human ultimatum and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the laugh of a predator who had spent his entire life taking what he wanted from those too weak to stop him. No species in his experience had ever possessed both the capability and the will to challenge thee on the ground. His warriors were the finest in the galaxy, bred for combat across countless generations, feared on 100 conquered worlds. These humans had gotten lucky in space. Their strange weapons and unusual tactics had caught his fleet off guard. But ground combat was different. Ground combat was personal, brutal, decided by strength and ferocity, and the willingness to tear your enemy apart with your bare hands. Ordered his ground commander to accelerate the harvest. If these humans wanted their precious so badly, they could dig them out of the rubble. He would show these arrogant newcomers what it meant to face warriors in their element. It was the last order would ever give as a free commander. Sergeant Danny Cole made planetfall 17 minutes after the ultimatum expired. His drop pod screamed through the atmosphere like a falling meteor, its heat shields glowing red, its internal stabilizers fighting to keep him from being crushed by the violent deceleration. Around him, 24 other pods fell in perfect formation, carrying the first wave of human marines to the surface of 4. Cole had done combat drops on 6 different worlds. Each one had been terrifying in its own way. The seconds between leaving your ship and hitting the ground were the longest of your life, filled with nothing but noise and heat, and the absolute certainty that something was about to go wrong. His pod slammed into the ground in the heart of the occupied capital city. The impact knocked the wind out of him despite his armor and crash harness. But Cole was moving before the dust even settled, kicking open the pod door and rolling out with his rifle already raised. The capital had once been beautiful. Cole could see traces of elegant architecture, graceful spires and crystalline domes that caught the light in ways that human builders could only dream of. Now most of it was rubble. Fires burned everywhere. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. Warriors rushed toward the landing zone, eager to meet these new enemies. They were exactly as intelligence had described them, massive creatures standing nearly 8 feet tall with armored exoskeletons and 4 powerful arms. Each one carried weapons that could tear through armored vehicles. Each one had been raised from birth to believe they were invincible. The first wave of attackers was cut down in seconds. Human weapons fired projectiles specifically designed to penetrate armor. The rounds punched through exoskeletons like they were made of paper, dropping the massive warriors before they could even close to melee range. Cole and his Marines moved with practiced efficiency, covering each other, advancing in overlapping fields of fire, communicating through hand signals and encrypted short-range transmissions. They had never encountered a species from a death world. They did not understand what that phrase actually meant. They did not know that humans had evolved on a planet where the gravity was crushing, the weather was murderous, and predators lurked in every shadow. They did not know that humanity had spent millions of years learning to survive against impossible odds, developing tools and tactics, and an almost pathological refusal to accept defeat. Corporal Lisa Monroe moved through the ruins with her medical kit in one hand and her pistol in the other. She was a combat medic from a small town in Ohio, a woman who had joined the military to pay for college, and discovered that she had a talent for keeping people alive in the worst possible circumstances. She found a wounded civilian trapped beneath a collapsed wall. The creature was small, barely reaching her waist, with delicate wings and multifaceted eyes that showed nothing but terror. Monroe holstered her pistol and began working to free the survivor, her hands steady despite the sounds of battle echoing all around her. A warrior emerged from a nearby building, drawn by the sounds of her work. It charged toward her with all 4 arms raised, claws gleaming in the firelight, a war cry building in its throat. Monroe drew her pistol and shot it 3 times without looking up from her patient. The warrior collapsed less than 10 feet away, its war cry dying in its ruined throat. She finished treating the survivor and smiled at him, speaking in a calm voice even though she knew he could not understand her words. She told him that everything would be all right. She told him that help had arrived. She told him that the humans would protect him. They would later tell stories about that moment, about the small human female who had smiled at him while killing enemies without even glancing in their direction, about the absolute certainty in her voice when she promised him safety, about the way her hands never trembled, not once, even as plasma bolts scorched the air around her. Sergeant Cole led the assault on the central command post. It was a fortified building near the center of the city, surrounded by barricades and heavy weapons emplacements. The ground commander had retreated there with his personal guard, determined to make a final stand. Cole did not give them the chance. His team breached the walls using shaped charges, blowing holes through the fortifications and rushing inside before the dust could settle. They swept through the corridors with brutal efficiency, clearing rooms, eliminating resistance, pressing forward without hesitation or mercy. The warriors fought hard. They were brave and skilled and utterly committed to their cause. But they were facing enemies who had been fighting and killing and surviving since before recorded history. They were facing the children of a death world, creatures who had evolved in an environment so hostile that simply staying alive required constant vigilance and aggression. Cole found the ground commander in the deepest chamber of the command post. He was enormous, even by standards, his body covered in scars from dozens of battles. He carried a ceremonial blade in his upper arms, a weapon that had tasted the blood of countless victims over the years. The commander charged with a roar that shook the walls. He was fast for his size, terrifyingly fast, his blade sweeping toward Cole in an arc that would have cut a normal opponent in half. Cole shot him twice in the chest, then once more when he tried to rise. The whole fight lasted approximately 8 seconds. The personal guard died where they stood, cut down by the Marines who had followed Cole into the chamber. When the last echo of gunfire faded, only humans remained standing. Above the planet, Captain received word that the ground operation was complete. All surviving prisoners had been secured. Casualties exceeded 90%. Human casualties were minimal. They had delivered their reply. The predators had learned what it meant to become prey. 3 weeks had passed since the Battle of 4. 3 weeks of recovery and reconstruction and difficult conversations. 3 weeks during which the entire galaxy had slowly come to terms with what had happened in that remote star system. Ambassador stood before the full Galactic Council, his small reptilian body dwarfed by the massive chamber around him. Representatives from over 200 species filled the tiered seating, their holographic forms flickering slightly as transmission signals traveled across the vast distances of space. Every eye was fixed on the ambassador. Every mind was focused on the report he was about to deliver. The silence was absolute. Began with the numbers because numbers could not lie and numbers could not be misinterpreted. A human strike force of 6 vessels had engaged a fleet of 15 warships. The battle had lasted less than an hour. 11 ships had been destroyed. 3 had surrendered. The human fleet had suffered no losses. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These numbers challenged everything they thought they knew about military capability and the balance of power in the galaxy. Continued. Human ground forces numbering fewer than 300 Marines had landed on 4 and engaged over 2,000 warriors. The engagement had lasted approximately 4 hours. When it ended, the ground forces had been eliminated as a fighting unit. Casualties during the human intervention were minimal. Human casualties were 12 wounded, none killed. The chamber fell silent again. 12 wounded. Against an enemy that most species considered unstoppable, against warriors who had conquered world after world without ever facing a force capable of challenging them. Ambassador paused to let the information sink in before delivering the final part of his report. The entire operation, from receiving the distress signal to evacuating the last survivor, had taken less than 48 hours. The humans had traveled 18 hours through fold space, fought 2 separate engagements, secured the planet, and begun humanitarian operations before most Council species could have even assembled a response fleet. When finished speaking, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The implications of what they had just heard were slowly settling over the assembled representatives like a heavy fog. Captain Jack attended the session via holographic link from the Resolute. He stood in his dress uniform, his hands clasped behind his back, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts or feelings. Several council members had requested his presence. They wanted to hear from the human commander directly. They wanted to understand what had happened and why. The council chairman was a tall being with silver fur and ancient eyes. He had led the council for nearly 40 standard years and had seen conflicts rise and fall across the galaxy. He had never seen anything quite like this. He asked if he wished to make a statement, considered the question for a long moment before responding. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying clearly through the chamber despite the vast distances separating him from his audience. He told them that humanity had not come to the stars seeking war. They had spent centuries fighting among themselves, learning through terrible experience that violence was the worst possible solution to any problem. They had united as a species precisely because they understood how destructive conflict could be. They had reached out to the galactic community hoping to find friendship, knowledge, and the opportunity to be part of something greater than themselves. But they had also come with clear memories of their own history, memories written in blood and fire, memories of times when the strong had preyed upon the weak, when the powerful had enslaved the helpless, when innocent people had been told that their lives held no value. Humans knew what it meant to be hunted. They knew what it meant to be oppressed. They knew what it meant to watch everything they loved be destroyed by those who cared nothing for justice or mercy. So when they called for help, humanity answered. Not because they sought glory or conquest or recognition, not because they wanted to prove their strength or demonstrate their power. They answered because someone was suffering and they had the ability to stop it. Paused, his eyes sweeping across the assembled representatives. Many of them had voted against admitting humans to the galactic community years ago. They had argued that such a violent species could never integrate peacefully. They had worried that humans would bring chaos and destruction wherever they went. Now those same representatives sat in stunned silence, realizing that they had made a different kind of mistake. They had underestimated these creatures from the death world. They had failed to understand that the same capacity for violence that made humans so dangerous also made them the most capable protectors the galaxy had ever seen. Continued, he told them that humanity hoped this would be the last time such action was necessary. They hoped that the galaxy would take notice of what had happened at 4. They hoped that those who preyed upon the innocent would reconsider their choices. But if they did not, if another species called for aid, humanity would answer again, and again, and again, as many times as necessary for as long as necessary until the message was finally understood. The of Earth had sent their reply to the. They had written it in fire and blood, and the screams of those who had thought themselves invincible. Let the galaxy take note. Let the predators and the slavers and the tyrants understand what waited for them in the darkness between the stars. Humanity was watching, and humanity was not afraid. 6 months later, the completed construction of a memorial in their rebuilt capital. It stood in the center of a new plaza, surrounded by gardens that were already beginning to bloom. The statue depicted a human soldier, rifle in hand, standing protectively over a group of children. The soldier's face was calm and kind, showing none of the violence that had been required to save those children from the. The inscription at the base was simple. It read, "They came when no one else would." Delegations from across the galaxy traveled to see the memorial. They stood before it in silence, contemplating what it represented. A species that had evolved on a world designed to kill them. A people who had learned to survive by fighting and adapting and never, ever giving up. A civilization that had looked at the vast darkness of space and said, not with arrogance but with quiet determination, that they would protect those who could not protect themselves. On Earth, news of the memorial spread quickly. It became a source of quiet pride, a reminder of what humanity could accomplish when they set aside their differences and worked together. They had spent centuries wondering if they were alone in the universe. Now they knew the truth. They were not alone, and in a galaxy filled with wonders and terrors, they had found their purpose. They would answer every call for help. They would stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. They would be the wolves who guarded the sheep, the fire that held back the darkness, the voice that said no to every bully and tyrant who thought they could take whatever they wanted. This was the human way. This was the way, and the galaxy would never forget it.